Hi there, welcome to the Building Workflows in monday.com webinar. In today's webinar, we are going to examine how to best approach building your workflows or use cases in monday.com. We're going to guide you through the considerations and questions to ask yourself to better define your workflow goals before starting to build your boards. The answers to some of these questions will help you choose what is the most suitable board structure, although it is worth mentioning there's no right or wrong answer, only suggestions of best practices. In terms of agenda, we'll go through a quick overview of what is monday.com. Then we'll talk through some key terms so we're all using the same taxonomy as we're going through this together. We'll cover some must-ask questions before jumping into building your boards, and then we'll go through some best practices for board building in terms of what structures might fit best for you. Then we'll just wrap it up and you'll be off to the races. So first, a quick introduction. My name is Emily Williams. I am an implementation consultant here at monday.com. I've been with the company for nearly 2 years, implementing clients of all scales, so from a 20-person team to thousands of people within the teams or company. And I think I've really found a way to understand what's the best way to build boards, regardless of the scale that you're working with or how many use cases you're working with. So I hope that we can share some of this information with you today. And that kind of leads me well into my goals for today. So first is that I think that this can really help minimize your learning curve of getting up and running on monday.com and understanding what you can use it for. Second, it'll provide a framework for building in monday.com. So if it's, 6 months in the future and you have an additional use case, you can use this same framework and apply it to that, even once you're outside of your initial learning curve. And then 3, it's going to save you time because it'll hopefully enable you to build your boards right the first time. So moving on to kind of the first thing in our agenda is what is monday.com. So if you're new to monday.com, it's a work operating system that powers your teams to run projects and workflows with confidence. So a really customizable platform that can fit any of your needs, whether you're managing a recruitment pipeline or you're a PMO team, it can be built in a way that fits your specific use case and team. The main building blocks of monday.com are something we call boards. So I'm actually going to jump into a real board here and show you kind of the core components of a board. Again, just so we're on the same page as we move through this webinar. So jumping over to this screen, here you're looking at a board that I created. So up here we have the board title. Here we have different groups in order to group our items in the board. So oftentimes we see groupings by not started, in progress, complete, or another popular one could be Q1, Q2, Q3. And it can also be unique to your team. If you have buckets of categories within your use case or your projects, then we could group it that way. Within the groups, we have items. So each of the ones that I'm hovering over here is a specific item. And against the item, we have columns that are tracking data points against that item. So for example, with item 2, my colleague Madeline is assigned to this. She completed it and the date was November 19th. So we can add on additional columns as you see fit for your specific use case in order to capture some key data points or keep your team aligned. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well as we get into the content for today. So now that we're all aligned on kind of what is monday.com in a very basic fashion, we're going to kind of jump into the content for today. I do want to mention, if you have not watched a full basic webinar of monday.com or gotten adjusted to the platform in any way prior to this webinar, I would recommend going and watching a basic webinar before you go through this content and then coming back. I think it'll set you up for better success to kind of digest what we're going to talk about today. With that, I'm going to move on. And we're going to jump into the section of key terms. So what are the terms that we're going to be talking about throughout today and that you should be talking about with your teams and as you're building in monday.com in the future? So the first term is, what is a use case? at the most basic level, a use case is a usage scenario for a piece of software. So this term transcends monday.com, right? But the common use cases that we see in monday.com are the three that we're looking at below. So one is a data repository. What that means is I'm using monday.com just to track a list of my vendors, right? Nothing is really happening in that board. It's just kind of a repository of information. Maybe asset management. All of your completed or available assets are living in a board. Nothing's really happening with them, but you're housing them there for easy access. So anything that's pretty static and living in a board could be labeled as a data repository. The second one is ad hoc task management. This is a very easy one to get up and running in monday.com, and really just means that you're managing your task lists individually or at a team level, right? So those are kind of the two basic use cases of monday.com, and we aren't going to focus on either of those today. We are actually going to focus on workflows. So within workflows, which we categorize as a use case for monday.com, we're going to talk about two separate types. So a process workflow and a project workflow. And I'm going to go into detail on what that means. You're probably asking yourself, okay, what's the difference between a process and a project? And we're going to go into each of these in a moment, but just keep that in mind that that's going to be the focus for today. So now I'm going to move on one slide and we're going to talk about what is a workflow. So at this point, we're not even getting into process and project yet. We're just talking about what is a workflow. So the way that we have defined a workflow is a sequence of tasks. So a path to describe how something goes from being undone to being done. So that probably sounds fairly vague, right? And you might be trying to kind of assess what workflows you have in your company. But let me give you a couple of examples, right? A workflow could be a recruitment pipeline, right? We need to track our candidates coming in through the pipeline, going through the interview process, and then getting to the hiring phase. It could be a legal request system. We need to track all of the requests coming into our company, what we're doing with each request, how long it's taking, and when it's done. So any type of kind of system of working or something that needs to be accomplished can be categorized as a workflow if it has a sequence of tasks. If it's just kind of an ad hoc task, again, we're going to bump that to the ad hoc task management, but a workflow is more structured. So now I'm going to go into the next key term that we need to understand, which is what is an instance. So this might be the hardest one to explain. So an instance is the piece of work you are tracking within a given use case. So remember, we're focusing on the workflow category of use cases, and that's how these examples go as well. But let me give you a few examples of what an instance is within a category of a use case. So recruitment pipeline, right, that I just kind of mentioned. The instance within a recruitment pipeline would be the candidate, right? Because that's what you're tracking. The candidate comes in, you review the candidate's resume, you interview the candidate gets an offer, right? So they are the piece of work that is going from undone to done. In project management, right, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to finish projects. So projects are the instance, right? There are multiple tasks, sometimes hundreds, right, within a project, but really the thing that we are trying to accomplish is the project. And then same thing with the legal contract review. The contract is going to be the instance there. All right, so now we're going to dive into that distinction between a process and a project workflow. So the first one we're going to chat about here is a process workflow. So what is a process? The set of tasks in a process workflow is predictable and repetitive. You know what's going to happen from A to Z. Of course, there can be areas where you deviate from A to Z. That's totally fine. But in general, there's some sort of template or some sort of process that you go through in order to fulfill that use case or that workflow. So again, some examples below. And another kind of key part of a process workflow is that you're often handling a lot of these, right? There's a reason that it's a process because it's happened again and again in your organization. So you've kind of figured out a way to be more efficient and effective with those instances, and that's how it's kind of become a process. So again, you'll see some examples on the slide here, but that's what we're going to categorize as a process workflow. As we're going through this, I would highly recommend that you take a piece of paper or open your notes on your laptop and just kind of walk through this presentation with me, keeping in mind a use case that you're thinking about. So feel free at this point to jot down what use case you're thinking about, and you can do it after the next slide as well. But just kind of keep in mind your specific use case and try and plug it into what I'm talking about here. I think it'll help you have a good experience and take something away. So the next thing we're going to talk about is what is a project workflow. So we've talked about a process, and now we are on to projects. So project workflow has a structured path similar to a process workflow, but each project may vary in the steps required. Typically, the nature of projects is that you're trying to fulfill a unique goal, right? So there may be 50 tasks that are unique to fill one project's goal and 50 completely separate tasks to fulfill another project goal. So yes, in terms of we have a project and we do tasks, it's a process in a way, but all of the steps are unique and there's not you don't know what's going to happen from A to Z. So that's the kind of difference between a project and a process workflow. And again, the instance in this project workflow is typically the project itself. So there may be some confusion as you're getting into it and you're like, okay, I feel like the task within the project is kind of the instance, but what are we trying to accomplish? We're not ultimately trying to accomplish the task as a standalone item. We're trying to fulfill this goal of completing the project. All right, so I'm going to take a pause here for everyone to catch their breath. And again, if you have not already, feel free to note down the use case that you just want to keep in mind as you're going through this. And we're going to do a quick knowledge check. So we're going to talk about a few different use cases, and I want you to think about what they are, and then we'll talk about whether you're right or not. So here we go. We have a sales team. They're using a contacts board to log their different contacts and information related to those people. So think in your mind, what type of use case is this? And let me remind you of the different options we have. We have a data repository. We have ad hoc task management. We have a process workflow, and we have project workflows. So I'll pause for a moment and give you a chance to think about what this is. All right, so if you guessed data repository, then you nailed it. And we started off easy. So let's move on to the second one. Hopefully this one is pretty straightforward. We're just tracking a list of contacts. There's nothing actionable happening with these contacts other than, updating if something changes with them, but we're not really tracking them in any way. So the next one is a creative team using monday.com to track the steps of creating a unique advertising campaign for an upcoming product launch. So what type of use case is this? All right. So this is a project, and there's a key word in here that gives us a hint of why this is a project. So the creative team is using this board to track a unique advertising campaign. So if it is unique, this means that they haven't done it before, that they don't have a template for it. It's just kind of a standalone project. So it's a project workflow. They don't know exactly what they need to do. They just know that they have a unique campaign coming up and they need to manage a project for it. All right. So the last one here, a team of recruiters are using this board to track candidates as they pass through each stage of the recruitment process. So if you've been listening up to this point, I hope that this one is going to be an easy one for you, and I'll give everyone else another minute or so to consider it. All right. So this is going to be a process workflow. So you can see in this board represented here that each item is an applicant. Again, that's going to be our instance in this example. And we're tracking the process they're going through in the columns horizontally, right? And we're going to come back to the structure later on. But it's important to note that you can see that each of these applicants are going through the same exact step time over time. And that's how we know that this is a process workflow. Okay, so that was our knowledge check. We're kind of moving into the next segment of this webinar, and that is kind of 5 must-ask questions that you should keep in mind before we talk about the best structure for your use case that you've already identified. So again, with that use case you've identified, go through these questions with me, answer them, and then that will kind of empower you to move forward. So 5 must-ask questions. The first question, what is your workflow or use case? So I hope that you guys have chosen a workflow and not a data repository or ad hoc task management, but whatever you chose is okay as well. Workflows are just a little more complicated. So we've already talked about that, and hopefully you have it noted down. The second one is, what is your instance? So we've talked about what an instance is, but at this time I want you to actually write down or think in your mind of what that instance is that corresponds to your use case. Now that you have that, the third question is, how many instances are you managing? So how many projects are you managing? How many candidates in your pipeline are you managing? How many creative requests are you managing? Why is this important? You're probably wondering. So this is important because when you go to build your boards, if you're working at scale, we might have some different considerations. So if you tell me that you're managing thousands of projects versus 20 projects, I'm probably going to advise you on a bit of a different structure. So that's why this is important to keep in mind. Am I building for scale, or am I building just to have the best working experience? All right. How complex is your workflow? So if it's a process workflow, is it truly, I know the steps A to Z, or is there always, deviations from that? And are there conditional, activities that might happen? So for example, if this happens, then we have to add these additional 5 steps. But if this happens, we add a different additional 5 steps. So that's one level of complexity. Another level of complexity could be how many teams are involved, right? Are there a ton of different stakeholders coming in and out of this process, or is it just your core team? So there's not a formula for defining complexity in workflows, but I would just kind of consider what you're working with and feel out, based on some of the things that we're talking about today, what that complexity seems like for you. All right, the fifth one is, what are your reporting requirements? So are you building this workflow in order to give visibility to your leadership team? Or is it really important for you to understand resource allocation within your team, or to be able to report out on how many of X, Y, and Z you're doing in a given month, right? So what are those requirements, if any? This is just important to note because there are certain ways of structuring your boards that are going to be more amenable to certain types of reporting requirements. So I think these 5 questions are really important to keep in mind. And you probably won't be able to nail down the level of importance when you're building your first use case. But I hope, as you continue iterating in monday.com and identifying new use cases, these questions, keeping them in your mind, you'll start to see why they're so important as you build more and more use cases. All right, so now for the part that you guys have probably been waiting for, we're going to talk about best practices for board building. So up to this point, let's just do a quick recap of what we've talked about, right? So we've talked about a super quick overview of monday.com. We've talked about the key terms to know, right? So what is a use case? What is a workflow? What is an instance? So those kind of key terms. Then we've talked about the key questions to ask yourself as you're starting to build your workflow or use case. So that's kind of what we've reviewed up to this point. And now we're going to take that information and we're going to translate it into some of the best practices for board building. So 3 key ways to structure boards, and we'll talk about these more in depth later because you're probably going to be like, oh, I've seen more ways, right? But we'll talk about how this can be scaled and how it can be simple. But there are 3 key ways. So the first way is a vertical structure of boards. The second way is a horizontal structure. And the third way is going to be a hybrid structure. So what does this mean? Let me give you a quick overview before we kind of dive into it. But vertical structure means that you're tracking the requirements to fulfill the instance vertically down the board. So let me jump back over to my board actually and kind of show you real quick. So tracking vertically down the board. So let's say I rename this to project A, and this is, task 1. Task 2, Task 3. This would be a vertical management of project A, okay? Versus, let's say I have in this separate group, candidate 1. Firstly, I would never have projects and candidates in one board, but just for the purpose of this, and I'm tracking resume screen. And maybe I add another status column to track interview. So here I'm tracking candidate 1, which is my instance, horizontally, right? So I'm tracking it across the item. They go through the resume screen, they're done. Now they go through the interview, we're done. So this is a vertical management with project A, and this is a horizontal management with project or with candidate 1. So now you're probably like, okay, I get it, vertical, horizontal. What's hybrid? So hybrid, an example of hybrid at least, I'm going to go ahead and add a new column here, a sub-item column. And let's call this candidate 1, and we're going to say overall status. And then we're going to use the sub-items to track the steps. So we're going to say resume, and we're going to have interview. So you can see here that we're tracking the instance horizontally, right? We have an overall candidate status and we're tracking different data points horizontally, but then the process we're tracking vertically, right? So this becomes kind of a hybrid between that vertical structure that we're looking at up here with project A and the straight horizontal structure that I showed you previously with candidate 1. So hopefully that gives you kind of an initial understanding of these 3 different options. And now we're going to jump into kind of a 2 separate sections of the best way to structure boards if you're managing projects, and then the best way if you're managing processes. So if you have identified your use case as a project, then this next section is going to be relevant most for you. So managing projects. So again, projects differ from each other. They rarely follow the same exact steps. And typically the best practice for managing projects in monday.com is going to be to use a vertical structure, right? That's what I just showed you, where the project was the group name and we track the task vertically or downwards in the different items. So what I showed you was a vertical single group option where I had one group per project. The other option is a vertical single board, which is one board per project. So let me show you what that looks like since we did the vertical single group. So let's say this is define. Now we're grouping by phases, design. We group the project by phases, and this becomes project A, the board title. So our instance is now the board, and we're tracking the tasks vertically throughout the entire board through different phases. This is probably the most intuitive, structure. This is what people immediately think about when they think about managing a project in Monday. And it's really great if you're only managing a small amount of projects, right? So if you're managing a large amount of projects, we might want to think about, the group per project, but we're going to go into each. So these are the two different options, and now you kind of have them in your mind. So vertical single group. So this is going to be the most ideal layout for project management at scale, right? So all projects are tracked on one board. It's more manageable for a large number of projects. Let's think like hundreds of projects, right? And reporting is simpler. Since everything's in one place, it's very easy to do that roll up. So again, this is kind of a visual of what that looks like, right? Where each project has its own group and we're tracking the tasks within the items. And now we're moving on to vertical single board for managing individual projects. So this is the most robust and intuitive structure. If you have a clear way of managing projects, you're looking at this and you're like, okay, we are a PMO team. We manage projects in a waterfall way with clear phases. This is probably going to be the best option for you for sure. So you'll have a board per project. And later on, the way that we can kind of elevate this structure is by adding a high level project board where each project has its own item and each project also has its own board. So you can see a whole list or directory, if you will, of your projects that correspond to an entire project board. That's kind of outside of the scope for today's conversation, but just keep in mind that all of these structures can be elevated in some way. So again, some of the advantages here is it's great for robust project workflows. You can drill down on multiple different levels, and it's really good if you utilize the dependency function quite frequently. Cool. All right. So let's look at what an example of this looks like as well. So here is managing your project in a single board vertically, very similar to what we just shared in the account. Okay, so now we are going to move on to processes, managing processes. So again, in a process workflow, the instance goes through the exact same steps every time. And I say exact, but don't get hung up on that word. If there is some deviation, that is okay. We can account for that. But typically, a horizontal structure is going to be the best choice for process workflows. We'll show you both vertical and horizontal. And I think as we move forward with monday.com as a product, you'll see that you'll kind of work in that hybrid nature of a process as well. But typically a horizontal structure is going to be ideal. So let's jump into what that means. So cool. Ideal when the steps in a process are repetitive and repeatable, right? So some of the advantages here is it's scalable for a large number of instances, right? We could have thousands of instances on a board. I keep going back to this candidate example, right? If we're a large company with hundreds and hundreds of open positions, this is going to be a really good option to have one candidate per line item. We're going to avoid some account clutter by having everything very centralized. We're not going to run into any reporting limitations, and we can also update each status column to have different labels to really customize the process for us. So these are some of the key advantages. So let's jump into kind of a view of this. So one example is a sales pipeline. So you can see here we're grouped by new leads and active leads, and each item here, the instance is what? I'll give you a second to think about it. The instance is the deal, right? Or the opportunity that sales rep is working on. And you can see that horizontally, they're tracking the different stages. So qualifying, demo stage, negotiations. And even in this example, you can see that they're using different labels in each column. So in the qualifying stage, it's done, but in the demo stage, it's demo delivered. So it gives you some flexibility in using those different status columns. So let's show another example. So example 2, we're managing a marketing workflow who is doing campaign management that has very specific steps. So each item here is going to be a campaign and it goes through the same steps: research, creative, copy, etc. And you can see that they've kind of added quite a few more things to this horizontal workflow. They have a due date for each status column. They have a person column or a people column for almost every status column, right? So they're adding quite a few things to this workflow to accommodate. Cool. So now we've talked about kind of the horizontal workflow for a process and how that's typically the best option. That in combination with hybrid, which we'll talk a little bit about. But I also want to show you how you can use a vertical structure to manage a process as well, if that feels like it will fit your team more. So here we have one vertical board for managing a process. So the advantages of this is when there are multiple data points to be tracked and a large number of steps to take. So if you have a process, let's take employee onboarding, for example. I think this is a good example where a vertical board could be relevant. So an employee comes on board and they have, let's say, 200 things they need to do in the first month, right? That's going to be really hard to put in columns across a board and might overwhelm the employee. But by giving the employee their own dedicated board for you to manage with them with those 200 tasks vertically, even though they're the same exact tasks that every single employee is going to work through, I think it would probably make more sense for them to have their own board, right? So that would be a good example of, even though it's a process, a vertical structure could be optimal. Cool. Here's an example. Another great example actually is events management. So if you follow the same process for events, but you have, 200 steps that need to be taken for an event, it might make sense to give it its own board, especially if you're not dealing at scale. If this is kind of a unique situation, maybe you only have 5 or 10 or even 20 up to 50, I would say, events of this size, it might make sense to give them their own board. Okay, so now we are going to move into the hybrid structure. So this is arguably, or not arguably, I think this is my favorite structure, and I'll talk about why, because I think it gives a really good combination of vertical and horizontal structural elements. So you can get the advantages of both and still have a very scalable option. So again, what this does is it tracks certain points horizontally. Usually the instance, right, is tracked horizontally. Think back to what I showed where we had the candidate as the item and I was tracking the overall status in the column and then I was tracking, some of the steps in the sub items, right? I can jump back as well. Here's where we were. Candidate 1, overall status, and then we're tracking some of those steps in the sub items. So that's kind of the concept of hybrid. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So a hybrid board for managing a process. So here we have a campaign creation board where each item is the campaign. So again, the campaign is our instance. We're tracking some of the high level tasks in columns on the item level horizontally. And then you can see we have 8 sub items that we're tracking in vertically, right? So this becomes a hybrid structure. If you follow the same steps for each of these campaigns, we do have a way to automate the creation of these sub items so that your process can still be repeatable and you're not having to update each time, but it is generating in sub items. So take a look at our automations if that's something you're interested in. And I'll show you these sub items expanded as well. So here you can see these are the 8 steps that they go through. Okay, so what about a hybrid board for managing projects? So this is a really good option for managing a lot of projects, right? So you'll have each item is a project and you'll track the steps to complete the project, unique steps usually, in the sub items. So this is a super awesome option if you're tracking a lot of projects. If you answered to question number 3, which was how many instances are you managing, I would say if you answered more than 50 projects in a month, I would choose either this option or a vertical single group option where we're tracking the project as a group name, but all the projects are still on the same board, right? So again, good for scalable management of projects. You can see it's expanded here. So different from our process where those sub items were kind of preset, these are going to be unique based on the project that you're working on, just given the nature of projects themselves. All right, so hopefully you stuck with me through that. I want to wrap us up with some key points here. So, summarizing what we've learned. So, first, start by categorizing your workflow as a project or a process. So, keep that in mind before you start working on your boards. Answer some of the other questions to more deeply understand your workflow and your specific needs, right? We have a lot of structural options, and some of the answers to your questions can help guide you to one of those options, like we talked about today. And then the third thing is just to decide if a vertical, horizontal, or hybrid board works best for you based on your answers. So typically, vertical is going to be better suited for project workflows or complex process workflows. Horizontal will be better suited for process workflows or simple project workflows, usually not project workflows, but if you have something very simple. And then hybrid can be kind of the best of both worlds, right? It's really good for scalable processes and projects. So that is all I have for you here today. I hope this helped and kind of gave you a framework to move forward with in building your boards, whether you're new to monday.com or you've been working with the platform for months. I think this is a framework and a methodology that can benefit any user type. So let us know how it goes and if this was helpful for you, and hopefully we can save you some time. So happy board building and thank you for being here.